Wilson Grayson had never thought he would find himself back at his grandfather's old farm, a place he hadn't visited in years. The last time he was here, he was a teenager spending summers helping out with odd chores, mostly stacking hay in the barn and feeding the animals. Those days felt like a distant memory now, something from another life. Wilson had left the rural life behind long ago, choosing a path in the city where he worked as a restorer of historic buildings. He had grown used to the urban environment, where every second was scheduled and chaos reigned over silence. But now, standing at the entrance to the farm, he felt something stir inside him. The once familiar property looked worn and tired. The wooden gate hung loosely on its hinges, the paint on the old farmhouse had faded, and the grass grew wild around the edges of the driveway. The barn, which had always stood proudly in the middle of the property, was nowhere to be seen. Wilson blinked, feeling a wave of confusion wash over him. There had always been an old red barn right there, a sturdy structure his grandfather, Joseph Grayson, had built with his own hands decades ago. Now, in its place, there was nothing but a patch of disturbed earth, as though someone had hurriedly cleared the area. Wilson parked his car by the house and stepped out. The air smelled different here, fresh, earthy, but tinged with something unfamiliar. He approached the spot where the barn used to stand, his boots crunching over gravel and bits of broken wood scattered across the ground. As he crouched down to examine the area, he noticed faint tire tracks leading away from the property. Whoever had done this didn't just tear down the barn, they had removed something. But what and why? Before he could process it further, Wilson's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his cousin Mark. "How's Grandpa doing?" it read. Wilson sighed, running a hand through his hair before replying, "He's stable. Docs say he'll recover, but he needs rest." He hesitated before adding, "The barn's gone." "I have no idea what's going on here," sending the message. He pocketed the phone and glanced around again, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His grandfather had always been proud of that barn. It wasn't just a place to store hay or keep animals, it was a symbol of everything Joseph had worked for. After retiring from his job in the city years ago, Joseph had bought this land to live out his dream of farming in peace. Wilson remembered how his grandfather would often talk about the barn with a gleam in his eye, calling it the heart of the farm. Now, someone had come and ripped that heart out without any explanation. Steeling himself, Wilson headed toward the house. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a familiar but dustier interior. The old wooden floors groaned under his weight, and the smell of aged timber filled the air. He made his way to the kitchen, where a pile of unopened mail sat on the table. Most of it was junk flyers, magazines, and advertisements, but one envelope caught his eye. It was thicker than the rest and had no return address, just his grandfather's name written in bold letters across the front. Wilson opened it carefully, his hands tensing as he unfolded the contents. Inside was a notice informing Joseph Grayson that his property was in violation of local regulations, and that immediate action had been taken to ensure the safety of the community. The notice went on to state that an inspection had deemed the barn structurally unsafe, and that it had been dismantled as a precautionary measure. It ended with a vague promise to provide compensation, though no details were given. Wilson's eyes narrowed as he reread the notice. It didn't make sense. His grandfather had always kept the barn in good condition, even if there had been some minor issue. Why wouldn't they give a proper warning first? Why wasn't his grandfather informed before such drastic action was taken? Feeling a growing sense of unease, Wilson set the letter down and walked back outside. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them standing around here. If anyone knew what happened, it would be the neighbors. He remembered the couple who lived just down the road, Bill and Linda Porter, friends of his grandfather for years. If something unusual had been happening around the farm, they would have noticed. Wilson climbed into his car and drove down the dusty road toward the Porter's house, which was only a few minutes away. When he arrived, he saw Linda in the garden, tending to a row of flowers. She looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Wilson, is everything okay?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hi, Linda. I was hoping you could help me figure something out," Wilson said, stepping out of the car. "Someone tore down Grandpa's barn. Do you know anything about it?" Linda's face fell. She glanced around nervously before responding. We heard about it a few days ago. Bill saw trucks coming in late at night. We didn't think much of it at first, but the next morning the barn was gone. It was strange no one from the local council said anything about it beforehand. I'm so sorry, Wilson. We wanted to tell Joseph. But we knew he wasn't feeling well, and we didn't want to worry him. Wilson felt a knot form in his stomach. Trucks coming in the middle of the night, no official notice beforehand? This wasn't adding up. He thanked Linda and promised to keep her updated before getting back into his car. As he drove back toward the farm, his mind raced. Whoever was behind this had gone to great lengths to keep it quiet. They didn't want anyone knowing what they were doing. By the time he returned to the farm, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the fields. Wilson stepped out of the car and stared at the empty patch of ground where the barn had once stood. He didn't know who had done this or why, but one thing was certain: this wasn't just about tearing down an old building. Something bigger was happening here, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, Wilson woke up early, still feeling the weight of everything he had seen the day before. The thought of the empty patch of land where the barn had once stood gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole situation was off, more than just a simple case of local officials demolishing an old structure. His grandfather had always taken good care of the barn, and even if there had been some minor issues with its condition, there was no reason to tear it down without proper notice or discussion. It all felt wrong, rushed, and hidden. After a quick breakfast, Wilson decided to go through the rest of the mail that had piled up in the house while his grandfather had been in the hospital. Most of it was the usual clutter: utility bills, advertisements, and a few letters from insurance companies, but tucked underneath the pile was another envelope similar to the one he had found yesterday. This one was thinner, bearing a faint watermark that looked vaguely official, but again there was no clear sender's name or organization listed. He opened it cautiously, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The document was written in legal jargon, making it difficult to decipher at first glance, but after carefully reading through it twice, he began to understand its contents. The letter claimed that the barn had been classified as a potential safety hazard following an anonymous report. It further stated that, due to an alleged failure to address previous notices, none of which Wilson or his grandfather had ever seen, the authorities had been forced to act swiftly in the interest of public safety. It ended with a brief note stating that all livestock had been transferred to a secure location pending resolution. Secure location. What did that even mean? And why was there no contact information listed to follow up on where the animals had been taken? Frustration boiled up inside him. Wilson knew his grandfather well enough to be certain that he wouldn't have ignored any official notices. If there had been any kind of inspection or warning, Joseph would have dealt with it immediately. This wasn't negligence on his grandfather's part. Someone was lying, or at the very least, withholding important information. And then there was the issue of the animals. His grandfather's livestock was practically family to him. He wouldn't have simply allowed them to be taken away without a fight. Determined to get answers, Wilson decided his first step would be to contact whoever had issued the letter. He scanned the paper for a phone number or email address, but there was nothing of the sort. Frustrated but not ready to give up, he figured he could try reaching out to someone at the local council office. If anyone had authorized the demolition, they should have records of it. Wilson grabbed his car keys and headed out, determined to make sense of this mess. The drive to the council office took about 20 minutes. The building itself was an old, nondescript structure that looked as though it hadn't been updated in decades. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile and bureaucratic, with a dull hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Wilson approached the front desk, where a middle-aged receptionist with a tired expression greeted him. She didn't even look up from her computer as she asked, "Can I help you?" "Yes, I'm trying to get information about a demolition that happened recently on my grandfather's property," Wilson said, keeping his tone polite despite his growing irritation. The barn was torn down, and no one informed him about it beforehand. "I have a letter here, but it doesn't list any contact details." The receptionist finally glanced up, her eyes briefly scanning him before she sighed and reached for a clipboard. "You'll need to fill out a request form for public records. Once it's processed, we can provide you with any relevant documents." She handed him the clipboard, clearly eager to move on to the next task. Wilson stared at the form in his hands, feeling his patience start to wear thin. How long does it take to process the request? Typically 7 to 10 business days, the receptionist replied in a monotone voice. 7 to 10 days, Wilson echoed incredulously. This is urgent. My grandfather's animals were taken, and I need to find out where they are. I'm sorry, sir, but that's the process. If you want faster results, you'll need to contact the department directly. I can give you their general phone number, but they usually don't handle individual cases over the phone. Her tone suggested that she had dealt with plenty of frustrated visitors before and had no intention of bending any rules for him. Wilson gritted his teeth, realizing he wasn't going to get anywhere by arguing. Fine, I'll fill out the form. He took a seat in the waiting area and began filling in the required information. As he wrote, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. Every minute that passed was another minute lost in tracking down the animals and figuring out who had orchestrated this whole thing. He couldn't afford to sit around waiting for bureaucrats to do their job. Once he had completed the form, he handed it back to the receptionist, who gave him a perfunctory nod. You'll get a response by mail, she said before turning back to her computer. On his way out of the building, Wilson's phone buzzed. It was a call from Mark. Hey, Wilson answered, trying to keep his frustration out of his voice. Hey man, I asked around about the animals, Mark said, his voice cautious. It's weird. No one's seen them at any of the usual holding areas. Usually if livestock gets taken for something like this, they end up at one of the local farms or shelters, but there's nothing. Nothing at all, Wilson asked, frowning. Well, there is one place that might be worth checking out. It's a private facility just outside town. They handle unusual cases, you know. Stuff that doesn't get processed through the normal channels. Unusual cases? What does that even mean? Mark hesitated before replying. It's mostly for animals seized in legal disputes or from properties under investigation. They're known to keep things quiet, if you get what I'm saying. Wilson didn't like the sound of that. Do you have an address? Yeah, I'll text it to you. Just be careful, okay? These guys don't like people asking questions. Thanks, Mark. I owe you one. After ending the call, Wilson received the address and immediately set off toward the facility. The road leading there was narrow and winding, surrounded by dense woods on either side. As he drove, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. Something about this place felt off even before he arrived. When he finally reached the facility, he saw a high chain-link fence surrounding the perimeter, with security cameras mounted at intervals. The entrance gate was locked, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. Wilson parked his car and got out, approaching the gate cautiously. He could see several pens in the distance, but from where he stood it was impossible to tell if any of the animals were his grandfather's. As he scanned the area, he noticed a small intercom box beside the gate. He pressed the button, and after a few moments, a voice crackled through the speaker. State your business. I'm here about some animals that were taken from my grandfather's farm, Wilson said firmly. I was told they might be here. There was a long pause before the voice replied, We don't handle public inquiries. You'll need to contact the appropriate authorities. Wilson clenched his fists, trying to keep his temper in check. Look, I'm not leaving until I know what happened to those animals. Another pause, longer this time. Then the voice said, Leave now, or we'll contact security. Wilson stared at the intercom, his frustration mounting. He knew he couldn't force his way in, but he also couldn't just walk away. Something wasn't right here, and he was determined to find out what. Wilson stood in front of the locked gate, his frustration mounting by the second. The curt dismissal over the intercom had only deepened his suspicion this facility wasn't just some ordinary holding area for animals, and whoever ran it clearly didn't want any attention. He knew that barging in or trying to force an entry would only make things worse, but walking away without answers didn't sit right with him either. For a few minutes he paced back and forth, weighing his options. If this place was as secretive as Mark suggested, then going through official channels might take too long or, worse, lead to more stonewalling. He needed a different approach, something that didn't involve waiting for bureaucracy to catch up. Deciding to take a step back and think things through, Wilson returned to his car and drove a short distance away, parking behind a cluster of trees where he could still keep an eye on the facility without being seen. He pulled out his phone and tried to search for any information on the place. After a few minutes of digging, he found a few vague references to the facility in online forums. Most of the mentions were from people complaining about how their animals had been seized under questionable circumstances and were taken here without any proper explanation. Some claimed they never got their livestock back, while others hinted at shady dealings involving local developers and private companies. None of it gave Wilson concrete evidence, but it confirmed one thing: this place was bad news, and he couldn't trust them to play fair. As he sat there scrolling through the forums, he received a text from Mark. "Any luck?" it read. Wilson quickly replied, "They won't let me in. It's locked up tight, and they're refusing to talk. This place feels wrong. Got any other ideas?" A moment later, Mark responded, "I can ask around some more, but be careful, man. If they're dodging questions, they might be hiding something serious." Wilson appreciated the concern, but he wasn't about to back down. He had promised his grandfather he would look after the farm, and that included finding out what happened to the animals. More importantly, whoever was behind this had acted without warning or justification, and Wilson wasn't the type to let that go. He spent the next hour observing the facility from a distance, noting any movement or activity. A few trucks came and went, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least, not outwardly. Most of the vehicles were unmarked, and the drivers didn't linger long. Every so often, Wilson spotted what appeared to be security personnel patrolling the perimeter, but they didn't seem particularly alert, which gave him an idea. He waited until nightfall, hoping that the reduced visibility would give him a better chance to get closer without being noticed. If he could at least take a look around the exterior of the facility, he might find something useful: a gap in the fence, a clue about where the animals had been taken, anything. As darkness settled over the area, Wilson slipped out of his car and approached the facility on foot. The woods provided decent cover, and he moved cautiously, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. When he reached the fence, he scanned the perimeter for any weak points. The chain-link barrier was tall and topped with barbed wire, but after a few minutes of searching, he noticed a section where the ground had eroded slightly, creating a small gap beneath the fence. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for him to squeeze through if he could widen it a bit. He crouched down and began carefully digging away at the loose soil, trying to make the gap just large enough to crawl under. Just as he was about to slip through, a sudden noise made him freeze, a low rumble, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Wilson quickly ducked behind a nearby bush, peering through the branches as a black SUV approached the gate. The vehicle stopped, and two men stepped out. Unlike the security personnel he had seen earlier, these men were dressed in plain clothes, but something about their demeanor seemed off. They moved with purpose, glancing around as if checking to make sure they weren't being watched. One of them pulled out a key card and swiped it at the gate's control panel, causing the gate to slide open with a mechanical hum. The SUV drove inside, and the men followed on foot, disappearing into the facility. Wilson waited a few more minutes to make sure the coast was clear before continuing. The brief encounter had only heightened his sense of unease. Who were those men? And what were they doing here so late at night? He pushed the thoughts aside for now and focused on the task at hand. Slipping through the gap he had widened, he carefully made his way across the open ground toward a row of storage buildings near the back of the facility. The buildings were small and windowless, with heavy metal doors that looked like they were kept locked at all times. Wilson crept closer, trying to find any signs of movement or clues about what might be inside. As he approached the nearest building, he noticed something odd. Several of the doors had markings on them, symbols that looked like they had been hastily painted over, but were still faintly visible in the moonlight. He couldn't make out what they meant, but they didn't look like anything official. Before he could investigate further, he heard voices nearby and quickly ducked behind a stack of wooden crates. Peering out from his hiding spot, he saw the two men from earlier standing near another building, engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation. Wilson couldn't hear everything they were saying, but a few key phrases caught his attention. ... Shouldn't have taken everything at once. It's drawing too much attention. We didn't have a choice. The timeline got moved up, and we had to act fast. Yeah, well, if anyone starts asking the wrong questions, we're screwed. This place isn't exactly low profile. Wilson's mind raced as he processed their words. They had clearly been involved in the demolition of the barn and the removal of the animals, but it sounded like they were working under some kind of deadline, like they were in a rush to get something done before anyone could intervene. He stayed hidden, waiting for the men to leave before carefully backing away from the storage buildings and making his way toward the fence. Once he was back on the other side, Wilson didn't waste any time. He returned to his car and drove a safe distance away before pulling over to collect his thoughts. He now had more questions than answers. Who were those men, and why were they so concerned about drawing attention? What was so urgent that they felt the need to act without warning or proper procedure? And most importantly, where had they taken the animals, and what were they planning to do with the land his grandfather had worked so hard to maintain? Wilson knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, real help. His first call was to Mark, who listened carefully as Wilson recounted everything he had seen and heard. "This is bigger than I thought," Mark said after a long pause. "If they're talking about timelines and keeping things quiet, it sounds like they're trying to push through some kind of development deal before anyone can stop them. You should talk to your lawyer again. There might be legal grounds to challenge whatever they're doing." Wilson agreed, though part of him wondered if the legal route would be enough. These people weren't just bending the rules, they were operating in the shadows, using secrecy and intimidation to get what they wanted. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, and if he wanted to protect his grandfather's farm, he would have to be ready for whatever came next. Wilson woke early the next day, his mind still racing from everything he had seen the night before. The conversation between those two men outside the facility echoed in his head, the urgency in their voices, the mention of timelines, and the way they had talked about avoiding attention. It was clear that whoever was behind this wasn't just interested in confiscating a few animals or demolishing an old barn. There was something bigger at play, something they were trying to hide. Wilson knew he needed to act quickly before they had a chance to cover their tracks. After a quick breakfast, he made a call to his lawyer, Catherine Shaw. Catherine had been helping his grandfather with property issues for years, so Wilson trusted her. She was known for being sharp and thorough, someone who didn't back down easily when dealing with shady business tactics. When she picked up, her voice was calm but professional. "Morning, Wilson. Did you get anywhere with that facility?" "I didn't exactly get in," Wilson admitted, "but I saw enough to know they're hiding something. I heard two guys talking about rushing their plans and avoiding attention. This isn't just about safety or some random demolition. They're up to something, and they're moving fast." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "That's serious. If they're trying to push something through quickly, it might mean they're hoping no one challenges them before it's too late. Did you manage to get any kind of documentation about what they're doing?" "No, but I found some weird markings on the storage buildings inside the facility. They looked like symbols that had been painted over, and they were really defensive when I tried to ask about the animals. They shut me down immediately." Catherine sighed. "All right, here's what we'll do. I'll file an official request to get access to the property records and any permits they might have filed for demolition or animal removal. If they've skipped any steps in the process or tried to bypass regulations, we can use that to slow them down. In the meantime, I suggest you keep gathering as much evidence as you can. Photos, names, anything that might help us understand what they're really after." Wilson agreed, thanking her before ending the call. He felt a little more grounded knowing Catherine was on his side. She was right, this wasn't just about reacting to what had already happened. He needed to find out what their endgame was and stop it before they could do any more damage. Determined to follow her advice, Wilson drove into town to meet with a couple of his grandfather's old friends. Bill and Linda Porter had already shared what they knew, but there were a few other longtime locals who might have noticed something strange in the days leading up to the demolition. He started with Tom Baker, a retired farmer who lived a few miles down the road. Tom was known for being a bit gruff, but he had always been friendly toward Wilson's grandfather. When Wilson pulled up to Tom's house, the old man was sitting on his porch, sipping a cup of coffee. He waved Wilson over with a nod. "Heard you were back in town. How's your granddad holding up?" "He's stable, But he's still in the hospital, Wilson replied, taking a seat on the porch steps. I'm trying to figure out what happened with the barn. Someone tore it down without warning, and they took all his animals. You hear anything about that? Tom set his coffee down, a frown deepening the lines on his weathered face. Yeah, I saw some trucks coming through a few nights ago. Looked like they were in a hurry, came late. Left before dawn. Didn't seem right to me, but I figured it was some kind of official business. Thought they'd at least talk to Joseph about it. They didn't, Wilson said grimly, and now I'm trying to figure out who's behind it. Did you notice anything unusual about the trucks or the people driving them? Tom rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Didn't get a good look at the drivers, but the trucks didn't have any company logos. That struck me as odd. Most folks around here hire local contractors, and they always have their name plastered on the side of the vehicle. These ones were plain white, nothing on M. Wilson nodded, mentally filing away the detail. Plain, unmarked trucks weren't a definitive clue, but it added to the pattern of secrecy surrounding the whole situation. He thanked Tom for his time and promised to keep him updated. As he drove away, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. Whoever was behind this had gone to great lengths to stay under the radar, and that meant whatever they were doing was important enough to risk breaking the law. His next stop was the county records office. If Catherine was going to file an official request for documents, it wouldn't hurt for him to get a head start by looking into any recent activity involving the property. The office was quiet when he arrived, with only a couple of staff members working behind the counter. Wilson approached one of them, a young woman with a friendly smile. Hi, I'm trying to find any recent records related to my grandfather's property. His name is Joseph Grayson, and the property's just outside town. Sure thing, the woman said, typing the information into her computer. Give me a moment to pull up what we have. After a few minutes of searching, she printed out a stack of documents and handed them over. This is everything we have on file: recent inspections, permits, and any changes to the property records. Wilson thanked her and took a seat at one of the nearby tables to go through the paperwork. Most of it was routine old permits from when his grandfather first built the barn, property tax records, and inspection reports from years ago. But one document caught his eye, a notice of interest filed by a development company just 2 months earlier. The company, listed under the name Ridgeway Holdings, had expressed interest in purchasing several properties in the area, including his grandfather's farm. According to the notice, they planned to repurpose the land for environmentally sustainable development. Wilson's jaw tightened as he read through the document. This was the first solid lead he had found linking the demolition to something bigger. Ridgeway Holdings wasn't just interested in buying the land, they were already making moves to clear it out, starting with the barn. The mention of environmentally sustainable development sounded like a convenient cover for whatever they were really planning. He quickly took photos of the document with his phone before heading back to the car. With this new information, he called Catherine again. I found something. There's a development company called Ridgeway Holdings that's been trying to buy up land in the area, including my grandfather's. They filed a notice of interest 2 months ago. That's useful, Catherine said. If they're behind the demolition, they may have violated procedures by acting before they had full ownership or proper clearance. I'll dig into their background and see what I can find. As Wilson ended the call, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting to get his grandfather's animals back, he was standing in the way of a company that clearly wanted to bulldoze everything in its path for profit. The thought made his blood boil. His grandfather had worked too hard to build that farm for it to be stolen by some faceless corporation hiding behind legal loopholes. By the time he returned to the farm, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty fields. Wilson stood by the spot where the barn had once stood, feeling a mixture of anger and resolve. Ridgeway Holdings might have thought they could get away with this, but they had underestimated him. He wasn't going to let them take his family's land without a fight. As night fell, Wilson knew the next steps would be crucial. He would have to gather more evidence, keep pressure on the company, and work closely with Catherine to block any further moves they might try to make. The fight was far from over, but he was ready. Ridgeway Holdings had made a mistake when they messed with his grandfather's farm, and now they were going to pay for it. As the sun rose over the quiet countryside, Wilson Grayson prepared himself for what he knew would be a critical day. His conversation with Catherine the night before had left him with a clearer sense of direction. Ridgeway Holdings was clearly operating under the radar, using vague legal maneuvers and intimidation to force landowners like his grandfather to give up their properties. But now that Wilson had a lead and an experienced lawyer on his side, he felt more determined than ever to fight back. The first priority was to figure out where the animals had been taken, as their sudden disappearance remained one of the most troubling aspects of this whole ordeal. Wilson knew that calling Ridgeway Holdings directly wouldn't get him anywhere. From what he'd seen at the facility the night before, whoever was running the operation wasn't interested in open discussions or transparency. Still, he needed more information about them, where they operated, who was behind the company, and whether they had any local partners helping them. He decided his best bet was to keep digging through public records, but first he had to check in with his grandfather. After grabbing a quick breakfast, Wilson drove to the hospital. His grandfather, Joseph Grayson, was sitting up in bed when he arrived, looking stronger than he had in days. Despite his frailty, the old man's eyes still gleamed with the quiet determination that had always defined him. Seeing him like this only strengthened Wilson's resolve. This wasn't just about a piece of land or a few missing animals, it was about protecting everything his grandfather had worked for. "Morning," Grandpa Wilson said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" Joseph smiled faintly. "Better than I was yesterday. But don't think I don't know what's going on. You've been running around trying to fix this mess, haven't you?" Wilson hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, someone's trying to take the farm. They demolished the barn without warning, and they've taken all the animals. I've been looking into it, and there's a company, Ridgeway Holdings, that seems to be behind it." Joseph's expression darkened. "I figured it was something like that. A few months back, some suits came by, offering to buy the place. Said they were working on some eco-friendly project that would benefit the whole area. I told them I wasn't interested. This farm's been in our family for generations, and I wasn't about to hand it over just because they flashed some money in front of me." Wilson clenched his fists. "They're not playing fair, Grandpa. They're trying to pressure you into giving up the land by making it unlivable. But we're not going to let them get away with it. Catherine's helping me with the legal side, and I'm gathering everything I can to prove they're breaking the law." Joseph nodded approvingly. "Good. Don't let them scare you, Wilson. They think they can push people like us around, but they don't know who they're dealing with." After spending some time with his grandfather, Wilson left the hospital feeling more motivated than ever. He had a renewed sense of purpose, but he also knew that time wasn't on his side. Ridgeway Holdings wasn't going to wait around for him to build a case. They would keep pushing, keep escalating their tactics until they got what they wanted. He needed to move fast. His next stop was the local archives, where he hoped to find more information on Ridgeway Holdings and their activities in the area. The archives were housed in an old brick building near the center of town, and inside the air was cool and musty, filled with the scent of aged paper and wooden shelves. Wilson spent hours combing through records, searching for anything that might give him an edge. Finally, he found something: a series of land acquisition documents filed by Ridgeway Holdings over the past year. They had been quietly buying up properties all over the region, mostly small farms and old homesteads. In several cases, the purchases had been preceded by sudden violations or legal disputes, similar to what had happened with his grandfather's farm. It was clear that this was a coordinated effort, a systematic campaign to acquire as much land as possible, likely for some large-scale development project. Wilson took photos of the documents with his phone before heading back to his car. As he sat behind the wheel, he reviewed everything he had gathered so far. It was becoming increasingly clear that Ridgeway Holdings wasn't acting alone. They had to be working with someone local, someone with enough influence to push through the demolitions and animal seizures without attracting too much attention. But who? His thoughts were interrupted by a call from Catherine. "I've got some news," she said. "I looked into Ridgeway Holdings, and it turns out they're backed by a larger real estate conglomerate. The conglomerate has a history of shady land grabs and legal battles, but they always manage to stay just within the bounds of the law. They're good at covering their tracks." Wilson exhaled sharply. Figures. So what do? We need to hit them where it hurts their reputation. If we can find evidence that they've been breaking the law or bypassing regulations, we can file an injunction to stop any further action on the property. But we'll need more than just speculation. We need solid proof. Wilson nodded, though Catherine couldn't see him. I found some documents at the archives showing that they've been buying up properties all over the region, often after sudden legal disputes. It looks like a pattern. Good. Send me everything you've got. I'll start building a case, but in the meantime, be careful. These kinds of companies don't play nice when they're backed into a corner. After ending the call, Wilson sat in silence for a moment, thinking about what Catherine had said. He appreciated her warning, but he wasn't about to back down. If anything, it only made him more determined to see this through. That evening, Wilson decided to pay another visit to the facility where he believed the animals were being held. This time, he wasn't going alone. He called Mark, who agreed to meet him near the site. Mark had always been good at keeping a low profile, and Wilson knew he could trust him to watch his back. When they arrived, it was already dark. The facility looked as imposing as ever, with its high fences and security cameras. But Wilson noticed something new. There was construction equipment parked near the back, along with several large shipping containers. Whatever Ridgeway Holdings was planning, they were accelerating their efforts. Mark peered through a pair of binoculars. Looks like they're gearing up for something big. You think they're planning to start building soon? Maybe, Wilson said. But if we can figure out what's in those containers, we might get a better idea of what they're really after. They spent the next hour observing from a safe distance, taking notes and photos. At one point, a group of workers emerged from one of the buildings, carrying crates marked with strange symbols. Wilson's gut told him those crates held something important, but getting close enough to find out would be risky. As they watched, a truck pulled up to the facility and several men in suits got out. Wilson recognized one of them from the archives. He was listed as a regional manager for Ridgeway Holdings. The men disappeared inside the main building, and a few minutes later, the lights in several of the storage buildings flickered on. "This is it," Wilson muttered. "They're making their move." Mark glanced at him. "What do you want to do?" "We gather as much evidence as we can tonight. Photos, video, anything that shows what they're doing. And tomorrow we hit them with everything we've got." Mark nodded, and the two of them got to work. They knew the risks, but they also knew that if they didn't act now, it might be too late. Ridgeway Holdings had made a mistake by underestimating Wilson Grayson, and he was about to show them just how big of a mistake that was. The following morning, Wilson barely slept. He had spent most of the night reviewing the photos and videos he and Mark had taken during their surveillance of the facility. Though it wasn't as much as he had hoped for, it was enough to confirm one thing: Ridgeway Holdings wasn't just interested in buying farmland for legitimate development. They were transporting something through the facility, possibly using it as a staging area for whatever larger project they had in mind. The crates marked with strange symbols, the late-night meetings, and the increased presence of construction equipment all pointed to something urgent and potentially illegal. Wilson forwarded everything to Catherine with a brief message: "This is what we gathered. Let me know what else we need to take this further within minutes." She called him back, her tone serious but focused. "Wilson, this is good. The photos show activity that's inconsistent with standard land development. Those crates, the unmarked trucks, they suggest they're operating outside the bounds of what they're legally allowed to do. I'm going to file for an emergency injunction to halt any further work on your grandfather's property. It won't stop them forever, but it will buy us some time." "Good," Wilson replied, his jaw tight with determination. "What about the animals? We still don't know where they are." "That's going to be harder to prove," Catherine admitted. "If they've moved the livestock off-site, they might be holding them on private property. We can't just walk in without a warrant, and to get one, we'll need solid evidence that the animals were taken illegally." Wilson sighed, the frustration clear in his voice. "So we're stuck waiting for the legal system to catch up while they keep pushing forward." "Not entirely. There's something else we can do," Catherine said. "If Ridgeway Holdings is planning to develop the land, they'll need public approval for certain aspects of the project: environmental impact assessments, zoning changes, things like that. We can use public pressure to slow them down. But I need you to stay out of trouble. Don't give them an excuse to claim you're interfering or trespassing." Wilson understood the logic, but he hated the idea of sitting back while Ridgeway Holdings continued their operations. He agreed to let Catherine handle the legal side, though a part of him still wanted to take direct action. After ending the call, he decided to visit a few more neighbors, hoping someone might have seen or heard something about the missing animals. His first stop was at the Richards family farm, about a mile down the road from his grandfather's property. Old Mr. Richards had always been friendly with Joseph, often trading supplies and lending a hand during harvest season. When Wilson arrived, he found the elderly man repairing a fence near the front of his property. "Wilson, heard about what happened to your granddad's barn." "Damn shame," Mr. Richards said as he wiped his hands on his overalls. "Yeah, it's been a mess," Wilson replied. "I was wondering if you might have seen anything unusual, trucks, strangers, anything like that." Richards furrowed his brow in thought. "Now that you mention it, I did see some trucks a few nights ago. Plain white ones, no markings. They were heading toward the old quarry road. Haven't seen any activity out that way in years." Wilson's interest peaked at the mention of the quarry. The road led to an abandoned quarry that had been out of use for decades. If Ridgeway Holdings was using the area to store the animals or equipment, it could explain why they had been so secretive. He thanked Mr. Richards for the information and headed back to his car, his mind racing with possibilities. Instead of heading straight to the quarry, Wilson called Mark and filled him in. "The old quarry? That's a smart place to hide something," Mark said. "It's remote, and most people avoid it because of the bad roads. You sure you want to check it out?" "I have to. If they're keeping the animals there, it might be our only chance to find them before they disappear for good," Wilson said. "Meet me near the entrance in an hour. Bring your truck, mine won't handle those roads." An hour later, Wilson and Mark met at the overgrown path leading to the quarry. The road was barely passable, with weeds and bushes encroaching on the dirt track. They parked a short distance away and proceeded on foot, moving carefully to avoid drawing attention. As they approached the quarry, they noticed several vehicles parked near the entrance, including the familiar unmarked trucks. "This is it," Wilson whispered. "They're definitely using the quarry for something." They crept closer, using the natural cover of the trees and boulders to stay hidden. From their vantage point, they could see workers unloading crates from the trucks and moving them into a large, makeshift storage area. Wilson scanned the area, searching for any signs of the missing animals. It wasn't until they moved further around the perimeter that he spotted them several livestock pens set up near the back of the site, with a few of his grandfather's animals among them. "There they are," Wilson said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to get photos of this. If we can prove they're holding the animals without permission, it'll strengthen our case." Mark nodded, pulling out his phone to take pictures. They worked quickly, capturing as much as they could without being noticed. Just as they were about to leave, Wilson heard the sound of voices approaching. He motioned for Mark to stay low as two men walked past, engaged in a heated conversation. "We can't keep them here much longer. If someone finds out, we're screwed. Relax. The boss says the legal stuff's almost handled. Once we get the green light, we'll move everything out and finish the deal." Wilson exchanged a tense glance with Mark. The mention of a deal confirmed that Ridgeway Holdings was planning something bigger than just acquiring the land. They were preparing to sell or develop it, likely for a hefty profit. But it also meant they were running out of time. If they acted quickly, they might be able to stop them before the deal went through. Once the men were out of earshot, Wilson and Mark retreated back toward their vehicles. They had the evidence they needed, but now they had to act fast. Wilson called Catherine as soon as they were clear. "We found them. The animals are at the old quarry, along with a bunch of crates and construction equipment. We got photos of everything." "That's exactly what we needed," Catherine said. "I'll file the injunction immediately and notify the authorities. If Ridgeway Holdings doesn't have the proper permits for storing livestock and equipment there, they'll be forced to shut it down." "Good. Let me know if there's anything else we can do," Wilson said. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had dealt a serious blow to Ridgeway Holdings, But he knew the fight wasn't over yet. If the company was desperate enough to act outside the law, they wouldn't back down without a fight. Still, Wilson was ready. He had come too far to quit now, and with Catherine's help, he was determined to see this through to the end. Ridgeway Holdings might have started this battle, but Wilson intended to finish it. The following day, things moved quickly. Catherine's injunction went through, effectively halting all operations at the quarry and preventing Ridgeway Holdings from moving any of the livestock or equipment off-site. The local authorities, prompted by Catherine's detailed legal filing and the photographic evidence Wilson and Mark had gathered, sent an inspection team to the quarry. For the first time in days, Wilson felt like the tide was turning in their favor. He stood near the entrance of the quarry, watching as police vehicles and inspectors swarmed the area. Several of the unmarked trucks were still parked inside, their cargo now subject to a full investigation. A group of workers from Ridgeway Holdings stood nearby, looking tense and agitated as officials questioned them. Wilson spotted one of the men he had overheard the night before, the one who had mentioned the deal. The man avoided eye contact, clearly aware that things were falling apart. Mark arrived a few minutes later, giving Wilson a nod as he approached. "Looks like they're scrambling. You think this is enough to shut them down for good?" "It's a start," Wilson said. "At least now they can't just quietly pack up and disappear. Catherine's working on getting full legal action underway. If we can prove they acted illegally from the beginning, demolishing the barn without proper authorization, seizing the animals without notice, we can stop whatever they were planning." As they spoke, an inspector approached. "Mr. Grayson, we've confirmed that several of the animals here match the descriptions provided by your grandfather. We'll arrange for them to be returned to the farm as soon as possible. As for the rest of the livestock, we're still identifying ownership." Wilson felt a wave of relief wash over him. Getting the animals back was a huge win, but he knew there was still work to be done. "Thank you. Please keep me updated on anything else you find." With that, Wilson and Mark left the quarry, knowing the legal process would take time but confident they had struck a major blow against Ridgeway Holdings. The next step was to focus on rebuilding what had been taken. Wilson returned to the farm later that afternoon, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in days. The empty patch of land where the barn had once stood still looked out of place, but for the first time he felt ready to move forward. Later that evening, Catherine called with more good news. "The inspection reports are in. Ridgeway Holdings didn't have the necessary permits for storing livestock or conducting any kind of operation at the quarry. Combined with the lack of notice for the demolition, we have enough to file a lawsuit for damages and wrongful seizure." Wilson smiled. "That's great. What about the development deal they were working on?" "It's been suspended, at least for now. Public pressure is mounting, and without the ability to move forward quietly, Ridgeway Holdings is facing serious backlash. I doubt they'll recover from this easily." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Wilson allowed himself to relax. The battle wasn't entirely over. Lawsuits and investigations would take time, but they had won the most important fight. His grandfather's animals were coming home, and Ridgeway Holdings had been exposed for their shady tactics. A few days later, Wilson stood with Joseph outside the farmhouse, watching as the animals were returned one by one. His grandfather looked healthier, stronger, and more at ease now that things were being set right. "You did good, kid," Joseph said, clapping Wilson on the shoulder. "I knew you wouldn't let them get away with it." Wilson smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride and gratitude. "We've still got a lot to rebuild. The barn's gone, but we'll put up a new one better than before." Joseph chuckled. "Damn right we will. And this time, no one's tearing it down without a fight." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the farm, Wilson felt a renewed connection to the place he had once taken for granted. This wasn't just about preserving his grandfather's legacy, it was about standing up for what was right and protecting the people and memories that mattered most. In the weeks that followed, with the help of neighbors and friends, Wilson and Joseph began rebuilding the barn. Ridgeway Holdings tried to settle the lawsuit out of court, but Catherine, true to her word, refused to let them off the hook so easily. The company's reputation was in shambles, and word spread quickly about their underhanded tactics. Other landowners in the area, emboldened by Wilson's stand, began speaking out about their own experiences with Ridgeway Holdings, ensuring that the company would face lasting consequences. By the time the new barn was completed, the farm had become more than just a symbol of Joseph's hard work. It was now a testament to resilience, community, and the determination to fight back against those who tried to take what didn't belong to them. As Wilson stood beside his grandfather, watching the animals settle into their pens, he realized that this experience had changed him. He wasn't just visiting anymore, this place was part of him, part of his future. Joseph broke the silence. "So you sticking around for a while, or heading back to your city life?" Wilson smiled, glancing around at the farm, the fields, and the new barn they had built together. "I think I'll stick around. There's still a lot of work to do." Joseph grinned. "Good. This place could use someone with your fight." And with that, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Wilson knew he had made the right choice. The battle had been hard, but they had won. And now, with the farm safe and the future ahead of them, it was time to build something even stronger.